Sure. So, traditionally in often phase 3 or registration trials, often the comparator is placebo. And in the clinic, we don't ever put a patient on nothing. So, although it's important for, safety to show that obviously there's not a significant increase in safety versus a placebo, for example, in maintenance, it's not mimicking what we do in practice in terms of decision making. So I think really setting the stage for a head-to-head trial really does help us understand if we have particularly, I'm going to use sequence as an example. So remember, the sequence is risankizumab on-label dosing, which is 3 IV infusions followed by an on-body injector, 360 milligrams every 8 weeks, starting at week 12, versus on-label dosing of ustekinumab. That's an important reminder because head-to-head trials are definitively done based on the label. No one is using off-label dosing when you're comparing in a true head-to-head design. So the dosing for ustekinumab is 1 IV followed by starting 8 weeks later, a subcutaneous or self-injectable every 8 weeks. The final outcome was at week 48, just as it was a 48-week trial. That's also a little bit different because often the registration trials are week 52 or week 64 in the case of risankizumab. So just even understanding the nuances about why, when you're comparing two drugs, it's important to always understand it would be versus what's approved and on label. That's number one. Two, the benefit of head-to-head is, as I started saying, is it's really important to start to understand if I had a patient that is presenting in the same way, same sort of what we call phenotype or demographic. This is an IBD patient who had moderate to severe Crohn's disease, who had already failed at least one anti-TNF therapy. Why am I making that a point? Because if we didn't know that, we wouldn't be able to say that this applies to all patients, or we'd be able to, or we would be saying, oh, is this anybody who walks in the door who I'd be debating between using ustekinumab versus risankizumab, or was it specific, like in sequence, that it was at least one anti-TNF failure? Another reason to remember is that another head-to-head, which was called CView, was ustekinumab on label versus adalimumab on label, and that patient population were naive to an anti-TNF. So it is important to also understand differences even within the head-to-head. So I think the benefit is it helps me know tomorrow, after I've seen the results, that if someone walks in the door that is moderate to severe Crohn's disease, who is already failing at least one TNF, this is what I can expect, and this is how I can counsel my patients. Data is really important because if I'm just guessing using my own personal experience, it doesn't always apply to that patient sitting in front of you. So when you have a trial like sequence or head-to-head, it helps you with decision making and knowing that your patient should, in general, if they fit those inclusion criteria that sequence did in this, I should expect similar results. Yeah, I think that maybe in the Crohn's era, I think we're pretty satisfied with where we are. We do have CView that did, in the absence of having risankizumab directly against the TNF, because I'm not sure that's going to happen, but let's assume that's not going to happen and say, well, at least we had an IL-12/23, so this class against adalimumab, which was, for moderate to severe Crohn's, I'd venture to say they're more on the moderate side based on their inclusion criteria, so not the same population. I think you saw that for first line that we could choose between them, and if we did do adalimumab versus risankizumab, we may see a difference. Now we can intonate that from maybe this comparison. So there are ways you can do it in your head and some math, but in the absence of direct head-to-head, obviously, that's not the rigor that Marla's head is not the rigor quite of what you would say is the bar for scientific robustness, but I think you could start to tell the story. So I think where we really are going to need a little bit more work is actually in ulcerative colitis, because to be fair, as you know, until more recently, because now we have upadacitinib for Crohn's, but it was not a lot of movement, as much movement in the Crohn's space, where we had S1Ps, we had JAKs. We're going to have 23s come into the space in 2024 for ulcerative colitis. We have Umvo or mirikizumab that is in the IL-23 space now. So I think we need a little bit more work in UC, because it seems to have been an explosion in the UC space with orals and sub-Qs and IV plus sub-Qs, and hey, sub-Q anti-TNF with sub-Q infliximab is going to be coming out. So who knows what that's going to do to disrupt the landscape. So I think UC needs a little bit more work, but I feel comfortable with where we are now. And I'd like to state that, adding another little bit of nuance, is in an anti-TNF naive patient, we do also have upadacitinib in Crohn's disease. So I don't think head-to-head between upadacitinib and risankizumab is necessary. I think if you had to ask me, and you know my take on this because of my obsession around it, combination therapy is going to be more where our discussion is next. Here you have a little bit of a positioning maybe with the sequence trial, maybe in a TNF, post-TNF exposed. So you're starting to answer maybe what the intent of the title is the sequence of things, for example. But I think the positioning in a TNF failure, although if you just take monotherapy to monotherapy, you've got a good answer here. So I think we could start feeling confident around that. But really where the magic is going to be is if we aren't meeting what these drugs showed us in sequence, and we're not quite at endo remission, is that the bar? And can we get there by looking at combining therapies, which is, to me, the revolution. This is, this evolution of this is a revolution, maybe IL-23, and the evolution is to combo, because you're still using a platform drug, and I call them platform drugs, where you can add things. So the IL-23s, the integrins, the safety of these therapies render them as what I call platform. And then you're actually looking at overlapping biologies. Remember, the Vega study in ulcerative colitis did look at combining anti-TNF, golimumab, granted, plus guselkumab, IL-23, and did show that there was a benefit in combining those in induction and then monotherapy and maintenance. The duet trials are going to be looking at it also in maintenance. So we keep upping our game, and I think in the meantime, while we're waiting for that next paradigm shift, we've already started doing that and publications around it, but the paradigm shift will be using these therapies as a platform in TNF failures and making a decision as to whether you add or switch to a JAK inhibitor, particularly at the moment, upadacitinib, if you aren't achieving the remarkable results we see from sequence.